then all of that combined can increase your depressive symptoms.
Be authentic. And then it's like, here's your letter of termination, like a week later.
Oh, I love gossip.
I suppose we could look at monkeys, but I'm not sure we'd get the same results there.
Yeah. If you are someone that just has a really bad commute, you're going to have a worse workday, be less productive. Everything is political. Work itself is a political experience. The relationship between employer and employee is a political relationship. I think it is not appropriate to say don't discuss politics at work.
Keaton Fletcher is an assistant professor of psychology at Colorado State University and host of the Healthy Work podcast. Keaton, thank you for joining me.
Thanks for having me, man.
What is the current state of the modern workplace? How do you believe people are doing in general right now?
Yeah, that's a great question. You see a lot in popular media and just sort of on social media of the anti-work movement, of quiet quitting and burnout just being rampant, and a lot of pushback against like return to office initiatives. And so I think broadly burnt out and the workers are not in a great place. That said, we still have kind of record profits and growth. And so from a different perspective, macro level, I suppose things are going well. But if you talk to the workers themselves broadly, I think sentiment is really shifting towards people wanting more of work-life balance and questioning, is it worth it when I can't afford a house or I can't afford rent? And why am I doing this? So unhealthy, I think.
Economics playing a big part in that right now.
Definitely.
Outside of that, what else do you think is causing it? Outside of like the general economic dissatisfaction that's going on right now?
There's an argument to be made that we've seen sort of a shift in the psychological contract breach, where there was historically, or at least like in recent memory, this expectation that you had either an explicit or an implicit relationship with your employer, where they would provide adequate resources for you. You get a sweet pension fund. They care about you as a person. They'll pay to train you and develop you. You can have a sustainable career with one company. And then over time, as companies have worked to continue to make a profit and minimize expenses, labor is the greatest expense. And it's an expense that in your books can never show up as an asset. And so we see salaries stagnate. We see benefits like pension funds that really encourage individuals to stay with companies being reduced. And so over time, you see the tangible benefits decrease. And then I think in recent eras, especially sort of the catalyst being COVID, where we have in name recognition that frontline employees are heroes or frontline employees are critical workers, but the pay doesn't reflect that. The benefits don't reflect that. Even the respect doesn't reflect that, right? The relationship with the employer themselves. And so over time, the jobs have changed, both financial and also social benefits, right? Because the other part of this too is that work can be meaningful, right? That work can provide you with resources and psychological fulfillment in a way that other things don't necessarily, right? But when the job is designed to extract as much from you as possible, it's not necessarily designed in a way that's fulfilling. And so when people say people don't want to work anymore, not only like have people been saying that for forever, but inherent in sort of the human condition, people do want to work. It's just not, they don't necessarily want to work in a way that isn't fulfilling, in jobs that aren't designed to be psychologically meaningful.
Yeah. And speaking to that fulfilling part of it, I feel that happiness generally is described in a lot of psychological theories as a proportion of whether or not you are doing better relative to where you were before. And I think a lot of people are waking up because of COVID, because all of a sudden you're not doing better than you were before. Financially speaking, if you were able to work at home and now they're telling you to come back to the office, that's a downgrade. And vice versa, a lot of people lost their jobs and are continuing to lose their jobs. I also see people talking about just more generally in the broader online community about relative growth compared to their parents. And for the first time in maybe 100 years, this is going to be one of those generations that's not going to do as well as their parents did. At least that's what a lot of people are saying.
Yeah, the promise of if you work hard, things will be better than they were for you as a child, right? You're going to live a better life, or they'll be better for you in 3 years than they were last year. Is I think we see the current workforce who's lived through the 2008 financial crisis were largely children or young adults during even like the dot-com bust in the early 2000s, and then obviously COVID. We've seen that like progressively that promise of work hard, play by the rules, you'll get ahead, you'll have a better life isn't isn't being and probably has no chance of being fulfilled. And so then we have a reorientation of values of focusing really just on meeting our psychological needs, right? Which manifests in different ways.
Yeah, manifests in a lot of ways. A lot of the current cultural shifts, I think, are probably related to that in some way, which is a great segue to, perhaps some of these things are happening at work. You mentioned masculine contest culture in one of your podcasts. What is that and how does that function?
Yeah, so this is really cool construct. I'm not an expert in this
Yeah.
specifically, but one of our guests and a good friend of mine did research on this for I think his dissertation. It might have been his thesis, but it's this notion that there are certain workplaces that are defined by a very unique culture of contest. And like, I guess before I describe it, I just want to put in your head the image of like the Wolf of Wall Street, where it is, we have to work hard. It's the grind mindset. You have to be like physically fit or physically intimidating. There's this value of physicality and stereotypically masculine behavior. It's dog eat dog. And so not only is it competitive, but it is like cutthroat competitive. And the notion here is that there are certain workplaces that are higher in this culture, they're more likely to endorse this. And in the short term, it can be beneficial, right? It can really produce results. If you think about like a cutthroat top tier law firm or accounting firm or investment firm, you might see this culture, and then you might see people really succeeding and turning a profit and making a killing for themselves. But over the long run, there's negative outcomes to this, just like a lot of these more similar types of like leadership behaviors, like abusive supervision in the short term shows positive gains for the company and the individual, but in the long run is also like going to burn people out. And what you see is that the people who work there, it doesn't have to be just men. We just call it masculine or the masculine contest culture, because again, this is like stereotypically masculine behaviors. But you see anyone who's in these workplaces having to abide by these rules, to abide by this culture in order to succeed. And again, in the short term, it's beneficial for the company and for the person. But in the long run, you see a lot of burnout, a lot of turnover, negative health consequences for everyone who's in it. But especially for people who have to straddle the line. If you might be a man who, this is specifically from the work of Joe Regina. If you're a man who is not necessarily high in like competitiveness as a person, you have to like work a little bit harder because you fit the masculine stereotype, but you don't necessarily fit the competitive. So you can play, and you have to like be under this stress of trying to play. And similarly, if you're a woman and you're higher in competitiveness, again, it's really stressful because you can play, you have that competitiveness, but you don't necessarily fit the masculine stereotype. And so you're constantly just trying to like almost fit in and like really grind. And so the only people that like succeed in these are people who are hyper masculine and hyper competitive. And then also, it's not really succeeding, but it's getting out. It's the people who aren't competitive and aren't masculine or high in stereotypical masculinity, who recognize like this is not for me. Like I'm not even going to try, and then they get out, and so they're not affected nearly as much. But at least in the short term, because then there's the issue of like a lot of these organizations that are high in this culture tend to be where you can make a lot of money, like from an economic perspective. And so might it be that people who are not stereotypically masculine and not stereotypically competitive are being boxed out of opportunities just because of this culture that really doesn't serve anyone. You can be as productive, you can be as effective at your job and as an organization without having this type of culture. But it's something that, again, like Wolf of Wall Street is almost like glamorized.
Yeah, my first thought immediately was sales positions. If you've ever been in one, I'm not sure if you have, but they lend themselves to that quite a lot because there is that direct competition, whether or not that's going to be your customer,
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
or theirs. So that and real estate, I see real estate kind of being hyper masculinized a lot online. It's very romanticized right now, though I'm not sure how much it will be for much longer. But
Yeah.
due to the current state of things, so is there a significant difference in that competitive behavior between men and women?
So we do see gender differences with competitiveness, whether we're talking about the behavioral manifestation or we're talking about like self-report, like I view myself as competitive. Where on average men tend to be, or like I guess the average man tends to be more competitive and engage in more competitive behavior than a woman. But certainly there's a lot of variation there, right? So you have in the top 25% of competitive people, women represented. And then I think big caveat here is anytime you start to like talk about gender differences with something like this, people can take it to be like, well, obviously then men should be in these competitive positions and women shouldn't be, right? There's this gender essentialist perspective, but really like you, as a psychologist, we want to like highlight and put a big stop sign and say like, you can't draw that conclusion. We don't know why there's this gender difference. Is it that like society punishes women for being competitive and praises men for, or sorry, yeah, and praises men for being competitive? Or is it that there is some sort of like gender essentialism component or some sort of interaction? And we don't really have great answers for any of those. I think the safest assumption is that it's largely societally pushed. But we can't say for sure what drives these relationships. And so big caveat when we talk about gender differences is, you know, you don't want to be making policies or making decisions based solely on these because if you're treating them as set in stone or just some aspect of like, well, that's just the way nature is, you could be overlooking the role that culture or society is playing, and intentionally or unintentionally boxing, probably in this case, women out of, again, highly lucrative positions.
Yeah, so it's more of a difference of outcomes than you'd say, probably than rather like a difference in behavior.
Yeah, right. That is a big question that we have, and there's been a lot of research on: is it that if you have men and women behave the exact same way, women are treated differently from men, and then that will reinforce differences in these behaviors, and then ultimately the way that we act over time alters how we view ourselves, or is it that there's some fundamental difference that is driving these differences in behaviors? And we don't know. We can say that there's a lot of research and evidence that says that if you engage in the exact same behavior, women and men are treated differently. They do receive different benefits. For example, like having a baby in the workplace, we know that there's this daddy bonus and a mommy like cut where women are side ramped and off tracked and receive like pay cuts, whereas men actually receive higher salaries after having children, and it's the exact same behavior, right? Or in the lab, you can experimentally manipulate these behaviors to get a little bit cleaner at people's reactions, and you see that there are differences in how people respond to the exact same behaviors. But again, that alone can't say, is this why we see these differences? It's evidence to say that it's probably not entirely just nature, but it's also not enough evidence to say like it's entirely just nurture or like the environment. And there's one perspective that I don't know personally if I buy, but I think it's a really interesting perspective, is that like, especially when it comes to gender differences, like we just can't ever know because gender and culture have been so intertwined and so highly policed for so long that to study them in a vacuum is really impossible. And that the best path forward is assuming it's probably a little bit of both. and in that case, err on the side of inclusion.
Yeah, I suppose we could look at monkeys, but I'm not sure we'd get the same results there.
Yeah.
What about poor sleep and fatigue? You mentioned those in relation to work sometimes. How do those affect work, and how are they linked to those depressive symptoms?
Yeah. Oh man. So sleep is such a cool thing. It's sort of like the canary in the coal mine with your relationship with work, for example. And so it's one of the most studied health outcomes as far as the field of biopsychology goes. And we know that like longer work hours, more work stress, more work family conflict, all is going to impact and reduce your sleep. And not only is it reducing the amount of sleep that you get, so our sleep quantity, but it's also reducing your sleep quality, where you're actually getting worse sleep, even if you're sleeping for the same amount of time. And what's really interesting is that it's both quantity and quality predict other outcomes. So we know that if you have worse quality sleep or less sleep, you are less likely to follow safety procedures. You are more likely to make errors on the job. You're more likely to be an abusive supervisor because you are limited in your psychological resources. Being tired is a big drain on your ability to do things. As anyone who's had a child knows, right? If you've got a baby, you're just in like a fog for 6 months. When even if you're getting the right amount of sleep, it's highly interrupted. You're not sleeping deeply, and trying to like process things when you're sleepy just like does not work. And that includes your emotions and managing your emotions. And we know a lot about sleep, but we also don't know a lot about sleep. And so largely our understanding of like what's going on when you sleep, because every animal sleeps. So we know that it has to serve like a major function. And we know that there's like a restorative function where your brain is literally cleaning up the trash that it's made throughout the day. Because as your brain is functioning, it is breaking down sugar and processing different pieces of information, and it creates toxins essentially in your brain that then overnight while you're sleeping, you have these little cells called microglia that come in and clean it up. And then you're sort of refreshed, restored, and can tackle the next day. And we actually see that process breaking down in people who have dementia and Alzheimer's. And we similarly see that people who have dementia and Alzheimer's tend to actually show early signs in so much as their sleep is dysregulated as one of the early signs of onset of Alzheimer's and dementia, which is really interesting and really suggests that there's a link here, because the other big function of sleep is memory, where while we're sleeping, your brain is encoding information that you learned throughout the day into memory. And there's this really cool study that was done about like taking naps when you're learning information. And basically, like if you study and then take a nap, you're more likely to remember that information than if you don't take a nap. So pro tip is like try to study and make sure that you're getting good sleep. It's not important just so you have the cognitive capacity the next day, but also really does help you make these memories. And so then on the flip side, we talked about outcomes of not getting high quality sleep or good sleep. As you mentioned, depression, there's this bidirectional relationship where one of the main symptoms of depression is dysregulated sleep. Some people who have depression have insomnia and can't sleep well at all and have really hard time getting high quality sleep or high quantity of sleep. And then on the flip side, another sign of depression is like hypersomnia, where you have people sleeping too much. And so we know that at least at like a biological level, there's probably this relationship between the two. And then thinking about more about like the behavioral level, we know that there's this sort of reinforcing negative cycle where if you aren't getting good sleep, that leads to worse problem solving, worse emotion regulation, more anxiety because of both of those issues. And then all of that combined can increase your depressive symptoms, which then in turn makes it hard to fall asleep or makes you sleep too much. And then it's sort of this reinforcing cycle. And so
negative sleep snowball.
exactly. Yeah. And we don't know why exactly. There's some guesses and some theories, but we do know that this relationship exists, and that one of the ways that some forms of treatment of depression, certainly not exclusively, but also focus on positive sleep hygiene behaviors and working to increase sleep quality, and reduce hypersomnia. So being like mindful of napping at inappropriate times or taking too long of naps. And then in the workplace, as mentioned, it increases your likelihood of having accidents if you are ill rested. It increases your likelihood of being just like a jerk. So not only affects you, but it affects your subordinates if you're a supervisor, or it affects your coworkers. From a company perspective, we know that it's also associated with what we call counterproductive work behaviors, right? So things like theft or gossiping, or things that like the company doesn't want you to be doing. And if you have worse sleep, you're more likely to do those, because the part of your brain that's saying like, hey, don't do this thing that you shouldn't be doing is not functioning as well. And so you're working more on impulse, and you don't have that regulation coming in on average again. So
Yeah. So for treatment for somebody that has really poor sleep, then I see recommended a lot red light therapy,
mhm.
as well as frequent exercise. Uh, how might exercise help to combat those issues?
Yeah, exercise is really important. And doing it mindfully is also really important. So there's this measure of sleep hygiene behavior. So things that you can do that set you up well for a good night's sleep, basically. And one of the indicators of like a bad night's sleep is exercising to the point of sweating within an hour of going to bed. And so on the one hand, we do know that exercise does make it more likely that you're going to have a full night's sleep, a restful night's sleep, largely because you are depleting the body's resources and sort of like forcing the body to like want to go to sleep, is one of the notions. And if you exercise outside, you're also helping with the entrainment of your suprachiasmatic nucleus, or like the part of your brain that deals with sleep-wake cycles and other hormonal cycles as well. And so things like going for a run outside can help you get exposure to, as you mentioned, like red light therapy, but even just like daylight helps your brain like figure out, oh, okay, it's daylight time, which is part of the reason why like people get so dysregulated and upset during like the winter, when you have such few hours of daylight and you're probably inside for most of them. Yeah.
What role does vitamin D play there? I know it's a sleep regulator. Doesn't it? It functions as a hormone rather than a vitamin.
I believe that. I know that it's an endogenous vitamin, right? So when you're exposed to sunlight, for example, your body will actually produce vitamin D by like converting other metabolites. But
Yeah, I saw some guy recommend 10,000 IU's a day, which is quite a bit. But his theory on it is that, well, we, evolutionarily, we evolved to not wear clothes, and we only started wearing clothes in the past, 20,000 years. So you would actually be taking in much more sunlight by surface volume. Uh, so yeah,
interesting.
you basically need way more than what you're getting, because not only that, but you're inside most of the day. So
Yeah, so I'm not a nutritionist, but my one concern about like my about like taking a lot of vitamin D is because I'm pretty sure vitamin D is an oil soluble vitamin, and those are the ones that you do want to be more careful of overdosing on, because your body doesn't get rid of them as easily, and they tend to store oil soluble vitamins in your fat cells. Whereas something like vitamin C is water soluble. If you overdose on it, you'll just pee it right out, and it's not that big of a deal. But something like vitamin D, or I think vitamin K, there are other vitamins that are oil soluble, are the ones that you do want to be a little bit careful of overdosing on. And I'm not sure what the like daily recommended intake is.
yeah, I've not heard that yet, but I definitely have to look into that for the future.
It's cool.
So poor sleep and rude emails. What's the connection there?
Yeah, it goes back to, you don't have that emotion regulation of, we've all written that email where you're just, you're not nice. And most of the time, hopefully
It's
you
usually a
have,
reply.
exactly. It's definitely a reply. It's hardly out of the blue, but hopefully you pause and say, well, maybe I shouldn't send this. Like, it's not in the interest of my career, or it's not in the interest of this relationship for me to send this. It might feel good right now, but like in the long run, this is going to be problematic, and we will regulate ourselves and stop ourselves from sending that, probably. But when you are low on sleep, or if you are also stressed out, right? There's other things that are functioning the same way, that it's taking your cognitive capacity, your ability to self-regulate, and depleting it for other reasons. When that is depleted, again, maybe you're stressed out or you're not well rested, you don't have that foresight. You can't have that planning process as easily. And you're like, no, this feels good. I want to send it right now. And that's largely the mechanism.
And so we already talked about exercise in relation to sleep. Now, what about before work? Does it improve or impair cognitive function in relation to work?
Yeah, that's a great question. Charles Calderwood and a handful of other researchers have some really cool research on exercise and like when to exercise and how much to exercise. And broadly, exercise is good. We know that exercise releases what we call brain-derived neurotropic factor, and that is something that helps you create memories. It helps you learn. We know that exercise helps regulate your metabolic functioning, so it helps you stay energized throughout the day. And so broadly, exercise, good. Now, as far as the specifics of like when to exercise, again, other than within an hour of sleep, it's which you shouldn't do. It's really up to the individual's preferences. There are some individuals who, because of maybe biological functioning, are more alert and prepared in the morning, and exercising in the morning results in better functioning throughout the day. There are other individuals who are at peak awareness in the afternoon, and so afternoon exercise is good, though you might be missing out on morning productivity. And then we do know that like exercising prior to trying to like learn something is also helpful, again, because of that BDNF release. And then as far as like how much to work out, like the degree of working out, if you were someone who works out because you love it, you're just a fitness freak, right? Go ahead and have that like CrossFit workout where you are sweating and on the point of like throwing up, and you feel like you got a good workout in. And that's going to be predictive of better performance in the day at work, and also more satisfaction, lots of better outcomes. But having sort of a medium workout where you're like, yeah, I worked out, but like I didn't break a sweat, or like it wasn't, mind blowing, is actually going to be harmful for you. You're going to like kind of ruminate about it for the rest of the day, and it's going to harm your work performance and your outcomes. Now, if you're someone who is not motivated to exercise personally, but like like it's a thing that you should do, that medium type workout where like you got it to the gym, you did some working out, and like good enough is good enough, and you look over the CrossFit people and you're like, I would never. That actually does result in better work outcomes for you, as well as like personal well-being outcomes. And then walking is good for everyone. So as much walking as you can get done in a day. I've got a treadmill under my desk right now that normally I'm on, but felt inappropriate during a podcast recording, because we know that also, regardless of your motivation towards working out, but especially if you're someone who's personally driven to work out, it's beneficial.
Yeah. So I'm guessing you have a standing desk then. If you have a
I
treadmill
do.
under.
Yeah. I also don't have it up right now. I'm messing up. I promise I do, though.
Yeah. Do you like it?
I do. Yeah.
Yeah. I've been looking to get one, but I haven't yet. Pros and cons of those.
So we do know that like ergonomically, it's largely better, especially if you have an adjustable standing desk, where you can sit for some of the day if you want to, but sitting puts a lot of compression on like your lower back. So if you struggle with sciatica, it can be really problematic. We know that it atrophies certain muscles if you sit for like too long of a time. Standing burns more calories, so not by like a wild amount, but some, and so it makes your body work a little bit harder. It's better for cardiovascular fitness. I also just like personally like it. I find that it gives me a little bit more freedom on like how to move. You can stand straight. You can lean over. There is some minimal concern that like your ergonomic as far as like how you type might be a little bit worse when you're standing than when you're sitting. But like that's largely pretty addressable by getting an ergonomic keyboard and mouse, or being a little bit just more mindful of how you're trying to type, things along those lines. And then the other con is barrier to entry. Like a lot of people worry about the cost of a standing desk. They can be, in the hundreds of dollars if you get one that is adjustable, or, the thousands of dollars if you get one that's fancy. But there are really cheap alternatives that I think people aren't super aware of, other than a stack of books, right? There are foldable metal ones that you can buy for like $30 on Amazon. And so big fan of standing desk. The research largely suggests them, but it's also not going to fix all of your problems. Like if you expect a standing desk to suddenly make you a healthy person, it won't. But it can be a tool in your health journey.
Yeah, I see sleeping is the new smoking now all the time, and or not sleeping, standing is the new,
Sitting.
or sitting is the new smoking.
Yeah,
I got it right
yeah,
there at the end. Yeah, but right
exactly.
now, I have my desk behind me, so I have my dresser set up so I can be standing while I'm doing this. I just think it's more comfortable, more natural during a podcast to be standing for some reason. But
Definitely.
that's just the way I do it. Uh, moving on, what do you think about hustle culture? Then we mentioned work life balance earlier. What do you think about hustle culture in general?
Yeah, I think the same concerns around like masculine contest culture are there with hustle culture, of the notion that your mind should always be on earning capital or always be on promoting your workplace, um, your work self. Largely, I see hustle culture more so associated with like entrepreneurial spirit of, yeah, you might have your day job, but like your real hustle is for your own business, or you're in an environment where if you hustle hard in the workplace, it's pretty directly related to your financial outcomes. And so there is that immediate payback. And we know there are individual differences where some people, their work is really central to their identity and they derive genuine pleasure from their work. And in that respect, I think hustle culture and there's this notion of like positive workaholism can have positive outcomes beyond just like financial benefit, right? It makes people more satisfied with their lives. They're meeting their goals. As you mentioned, though, when it comes to like work family balance, if you have a partner, if you have children, things get a little bit trickier. You're not just looking out for yourself and your own needs. So how do these all interplay? And how do you balance your career with your partners if you're both trying to hustle? Things along those lines. And so I think we see the literature's been mixed on the value of sort of like this grind mindset. Broadly, we see it leads to burnout. Broadly, we see it leads to worse life satisfaction, work family balance. But there are individual differences that put big caveats on that, right? So if you are single, if you are really career oriented and driven, and you do derive both intrinsic benefit from your work, but also extrinsic value, right? Like you have a direct financial gain from this hustle culture. I could see, and the research suggests that there are benefits, but we don't know like long term. We haven't traced people across their entire lives. Do you get to your 80s and look back on your 20s when you were hustling and think, oh man, I wish I didn't do that. Now I don't have, the life that I wish I had. We don't have those types of studies. I think the longest studies is maybe a year or two. So big
You don't
caveat on
really
that.
you don't hear too many 80-year-olds on their deathbed saying, "Oh, I wish I died with $1 million more in the bank."
Exactly. Exactly.
It's not very useful at the end of the day.
Right.
I do think it's more of a life stage thing. If you're in your mid 20s or your mid 30s, you might have a different perspective on what matters to you. I imagine if you're in your mid 30s, you'd have a more established family by that point.
Mm-hmm.
So I think that's important. Have you heard of monk mode?
I like just heard the term 2 days ago. So tell me more.
So essentially, it's hustle culture turned up to the max. So monk mode, it's this YouTube trend. I see it referenced all the time in these productivity videos. Essentially, you shut off your friends and your family and anything that's not central to the one goal that you're working on, and you dedicate 9 months to a year of complete intense hustle culture.
Yeah.
And so
I
that's your entire day basically for a year, and it's supposed to be life changing in that regard. I could
I
see
mean
why
maybe.
if you were successful at it. If not, then that's just depressing.
Yeah. Well, and we know like you have many more psychological needs than just productivity, right? Our one of our main theories of research or of psychological needs has three big buckets. You have a need for competence, where you want to feel like you're good at things, a need for autonomy, where you want to feel like you're in control of your own life, and then a need for relatedness. And it sounds like monk mode might help you meet the first two, but you're at the complete expense of the relatedness, and that's not healthy. I like maybe for a day or two, but I
Not
think
not for 9 months.
not for 9 months. That we are social creatures by nature, by design, and everyone, even the most introverted person, has a need for meaningful relationships with other people. And so, I would not suggest people forego those in order for productivity if they have the luxury to. I mean, that is one of my criticisms of the field, is that a lot of what we say are best practices are really privileged, right? The ability to not work out an hour before bed suggest that you have time to work out at some other point in the day, that you aren't doing two jobs or things along those lines, right? The idea of trying to find work family balance is really privileged if you can. But a lot of people, again, have to work two jobs or have to work, 20 hours a day in order to make ends meet. And so that is one of my criticisms of our field, is that most of our best practices are geared towards people who are sort of already a little bit privileged, and we don't have a lot of good advice for people, from a work perspective, who are in underpowered, underprivileged positions already.
Yeah, I think the idea that we could even sit here and have this conversation speaks from that point a little bit.
Exactly.
If you're in one of those situations where you can't handle that, you don't know this conversation even exists.
Hmm.
Uh, so you mentioned a few things there about what makes a healthy person in certain, like psychologically. So do you have any tips for maintaining that healthy work-life balance?
Yeah. So one of the biggest suggestions is the creation and maintenance of boundaries. And this is really important now more than ever, because traditionally we had these boundaries between work and non work that were temporal, right? We worked 9 to 5 or 9 to 6 or 8 to 6 or whatever the hours were. Notice that they start to increase over time. But then also, like, physical places, like, you could not bring your work home because computers didn't exist, or once computers did exist, it'd be like very gauche for you to, like, do work at home generally, right? Most people had these physical boundaries where you had to be in the office to do work. But now, pretty much again, here's the privileged part, a lot of jobs can be done from home or done remotely, and a lot of jobs can be done at any time. And so those boundaries get blurred, and maybe this leads over into hustle culture because, it's so easy to just always be working. And so we need to be a lot more intentional now more than ever about establishing these boundaries and maintaining these boundaries. And again, that requires a level of privilege that not everyone has in their workplace, but trying to find ways that say, like, I don't respond to emails after work hours, or I don't respond to emails between 6 and 8 p.m. while I'm doing family time with my family. Outside of that, I will be available for you, right? Maybe if, like, whatever the caveat you can draw, whatever boundaries you can draw them and maintain them, which is very effortful, because people will violate your boundaries. You will probably violate your boundaries. And that requires a conversation of, like, well, is this boundary actually not sustainable? Is there something fundamentally wrong with where we establish this boundary? We cannot abide by it. Or was that just a slip up? And how can we make sure that this boundary is stronger? And this is true for people who, even the person who is the most, what we call an integrator, where they really like work and non-work blending together. They're happy to talk about their family at work. They'll bring their kids to work, and they're happy to do work at home and shoot an email to a colleague from the playground. Um, Even for them, these boundaries are important, even if they don't like it. And so that's the number one thing to do, is, like, create these boundaries in whatever way you can. Again, whether that's maintaining relationships with people, creating sort of an individualized deal with your supervisor, or using technology to help you create these boundaries. So literally just shutting off your computer, or using one of those apps that shut down other apps on your phone for certain periods of time, until we have some sort of policy change. I know, and I don't remember if it's Germany or France, but they will, like, a company will be fined for emailing people after work hours. And there are companies in the United States that will shut off your email when you go on parental leave. So you, like, literally cannot do your work while you're on parental leave. And so, outside of those structural boundaries, it's really up to us to create those in whatever ways we can. And that's, I think, one of the best ways to find that balance.
Yeah, so it's keeping your phone out of the bedroom at night. Same
Yeah.
thing for sleep. It's also a great practice if you want good sleep.
Do you keep your phone out of your bedroom?
I wish, but
Yeah. I
I
also, one day.
I bought a a regular old digital alarm clock just so I could do that,
Yeah.
and then it failed me too many times.
Oh no.
So like the power would flicker at night and then the alarm would get reset, stuff like
Mhm.
that. So your phone doesn't do that because it has a battery, so it's a bit different.
Exactly.
So what about gossip at work? What do you think about that? And is it harmless, or are there deeper side effects to gossip?
Oh, this is I love gossip as both a construct but also doing it. And traditionally, the perspective about gossip at work is that it's a negative behavior that companies don't want you to do, that it is harmful. It falls in that bucket of counterproductive work behaviors. But in recent years, there's been sort of this understanding that what we consider gossip is really nuanced and isn't all the same. That there is some gossip that is basically like informal channeling of information that is useful either for the person who's hearing it or broadly for like the culture. And so you could think of if you are considering applying for a new job and you reach out to someone who works there, like, hey, can you tell me a little bit about what it's like there? Technically, that is gossip. It's an information gathering type of gossip and largely is beneficial. Or if you had an experience where you're like sexually harassed by someone in the workplace and you don't want to or don't feel you're able to go through sort of formal channels, but you're gossiping about it with your coworkers, to like, hey, just like stay away from this person. Again, broadly, will have beneficial outcomes for those people, right? And has like a different set of personality predictors. The person who will do that looks different from the person that's like mean girls gossiping, that is really designed to take down someone else. Whether you are using gossip to try to fit in with people, right? One of the an easy way to connect with people is to talk, and one of the easiest things to talk about is other people. And so, if you are making fun of one of your coworkers to try to get in with your other coworkers, that's a form of gossip that does have negative consequences broadly for the workplace. It creates a negative culture. It actually undermines your relationship in the long run with all of your coworkers, not just the one you're talking negatively about. And then there's the like sort of the most devious version of this, where you're not using gossip as a tool to sort of socialize with people, but you're using it as like a Gossip Girl style method where you are using it to harm someone else's career, where you want this person to not get the promotion, so you spread a rumor that they stole from the cash register or whatever. And so what we consider gossip is really broad, and the predictors of it all look different and the outcomes of it all look different. And there's also this really interesting gendered component to it too, where broadly when we think about gossip, we think about it as a feminine type of behavior, but we know everyone does it. And it's beneficial and harmful for everyone, that it's really not a gendered behavior. But when talking about gossip, like recognizing that background discussion. Even in my examples, I had Mean Girls and Gossip Girl, and those were both, feminine examples. And so recognizing that as well, just like this notion of what we consider gossip and that it needs to be expansive and really be viewed as a tool that can be beneficial if you're doing it sort of like a white lie, but a white gossip, I guess, a beneficial gossip versus malevolent, malicious gossip designed to harm other people.
Yeah, you'd almost call it feminine contest culture if you were going to reference it that way,
Yeah, you could,
which
right?
I guess would just be a more subversive type of contest culture, if
Hmm.
it were to be one. So I guess you could say, whether or not it's masculine or feminine, it's definitely different than your typical. Like it is subversive. It's not obvious that it's always occurring to the general populace.
Exactly. And again, it goes back to what are our stereotypes of these different behaviors. Um, Not to say that it is something that just women do or just men do, but that we have these stereotypes of different patterns of behavior.
Gossiping often talks about workplace relationships. Do you think they're positive or net negative on an organization?
So I think broadly, if we're thinking about any relationship, it's going to be helpful, right? Where it's going to help you meet the psychological needs. We know that there's some really cool research about having a best friend at work, and that people who have like would say, "Yes, I have a best friend at work," are more satisfied with their jobs. They're more likely to stay with their jobs, and I think there's some evidence that says that they perform better, right? Whereas someone who doesn't feel that way is going to have a lower level of commitment. And so broadly, if you are able to facilitate relationships between workers, then absolutely you're going to see benefits in both culture as well as like productivity and turnover, things along those lines. I think where it gets interesting is I don't know if this is what you meant in the way that you asked the
Oh,
question, but are we
romantic
talking about like
relationships. Yeah,
romantic
yeah, yeah.
relationships? Things get weird, especially if you're talking about like power dynamics, right? Where if you have cross-level romantic relationships, that can be weird. Or if you have romantic relationships that end, that can be weird. But on the whole, relationships are largely good because they help you meet that psychological need and help make work a meaningful experience for you rather than something mundane. In fact, like if we think about like a classic Fordian factory, right? Where you're just like on the assembly line, you're not talking to anyone, you're just pulling a lever. That is almost the worst job because you don't have an opportunity to meet people or talk to people, meet that need. You don't have an opportunity to really feel like you accomplished something or made something productive. And you also don't really have any autonomy over what you're doing. You were told you're going to pull this lever as fast and as often as you can, and that's it. And so that's sort of the least motivating job. And we want to get to the opposite end of that if we can.
Yeah, I think it's interesting nowadays. I saw it somewhere. I'm not sure where, but I saw it quoted that a third of relationships start at the workplace.
I mean, where else are you going to meet people?
I've heard it's increasing as well because there's a collapse of what's called third places.
Mm-hmm.
So third places are anything that's, it's not work and it's not home. So that's the bar, that's church, that's school if you also have a job. If not, school is your second place. But
Mm-hmm.
it's these other areas that you can go to socialize. And so when you have something like COVID happen and a lot of these places shut down, or they're honestly they're just receding in general right now. There's really nowhere else to meet people. So I've heard that that's on the rise, but you also have dating apps to explain for some of that as well for that gap. But
Yeah.
I don't know what your thoughts are on those and whether or not you've seen that as well.
Yeah. I mean, I'm not sure about the increase in romantic relationships. I would be shocked if there wasn't one. As you said, we do know that, like, as you mentioned, those third places, not only are they receding, but most of them are now sort of behind a paywall, right? Like Starbucks, for example, could be considered like a third place for consumers. Or like that was sort of their stated goal, is they wanted to be a third place, but like you have to buy a coffee to be there, right? The old school, at least for me, right? You go to a mall, you walk around with your friends, you don't buy anything, you're just hanging out. Like, we're losing malls. Parks are intentionally becoming less hospitable to just hanging out at parks, which is wild. Things along those lines. So it would not surprise me that you're left with this one avenue to meet people and you have something in common, right? One of the best ways to start a relationship with someone is like have something in common. So if you can start talking about work, maybe it's through gossip. That's going to be really helpful. In fact, actually, oh man, I just remembered this really cool social psychology study that they did with college students. And one of the best predictors of whether or not you started a romantic relationship with someone was how many doors away their dorm room was from yours. And that the closer their dorm room was to yours, the more likely it was that you had started a relationship by the end of the year. And so it's just like simple, like the opportunities to actually meet people and actually have interactions is one of the best predictive. In fact, like my wife and I, like we met in graduate school, and that's how we fell in love. I like to think of it as fate and destiny, but social psychology would say it's because we interacted with each other.
Well, it's good to see some people still have it working out for them.
Yeah.
So, what are your thoughts on remote work versus commuting?
Yeah, there's this trade-off, right? With remote work, as we mentioned before, you do sort of lose that work life, or it's really easy to lose that work-life balance. It's really easy to blur those lines. We see that during the pandemic, and as like people largely shifted over to remote work, productivity actually increased. People were working longer hours, in some ways because the time they spent commuting, they can now spend working. In other ways, maybe a little bit more a darker take is that when you don't have someone watching you work, you feel like you really have to show that you are working. And then also sort of the psychological perspective of, well, I'm at work, so I don't have to like physically work. Whereas when you're in your work hours and you're at home, you don't have that sense of like, well, I'm at work, I'm checking a box. So you're going to actually focus on your tasks. But on the flip side, commuting is also really harmful. There's this really cool paper that just came out that looked at like what makes commuting harmful. Is it the amount of time? Is it the predictability or lack thereof? Or is it just the quality of the commute? And their study found it was the quality, right? If you are someone that just has a really bad commute, you're going to have a worse workday, be less productive on average compared to people who have better commutes. It wasn't so much about time. Now, obviously, these things are related, and other studies with different methodologies found different emphases. But broadly, commuting largely results in harm for people. But there is like sort of a silver lining where it does give you time to what we'd say is like role transition, where you are leaving your role of the family or home behind and entering your role of work, or you're leaving your role from work and entering the home time. And I remember growing up, my mom, she worked from home as a medical transcriptionist for much of my childhood and talk about like decompressing. And she's like, I need to decompress. I don't have a commute like your dad does. I have to decompress. I need some time. And like that really, there's science behind that to back that up, that commute can serve that function. There are other ways we can meet that need. So if you're working from home, you can sort of simulate a commute in a much more pleasant way. So like take a walk around the block outside, get that nature exposure, help with your sleep there, get a little bit of exercise, and role transition. We are so easily trained to identify and recognize patterns. And so again, commutes are a form of pattern. So creating a new ritual, creating a new rite of this is how I start my workday, always with a cup of coffee and a walk around the block, helps you make that shift in a much easier way than if you don't have some sort of set ritual pattern. And right now, most people probably slide into a ritual and pattern that maybe not be serving them the best. And so obviously a commute, you have to do it if you have to go to the workplace. Like you don't have a choice about it. But when you work from home, you now have a choice about the ritual that you're going to use to get into the work day or to leave the workday and start home. And you can make it serve you as best as you can. And so my big takeaway here is like, if you are able to work from home, you do want some sort of ritual to bring you into that moment or bring you out of it when you're trying to start your home life at the end of the day. And you probably don't want it to be stuck in traffic on I-4 or I-75. It can be something that serves you a little bit better. And so commuting, if you have to do it, find that silver lining, find a way to make it serve you. But I'm a big fan of not having to commute.
Yeah, same. I can think of a lot better morning rituals than sitting in traffic for 30 minutes and then, rushing to eat breakfast on the way out the door. There's just so many better things you could be doing with your time. That's, I mean, if you commute an hour, or the time it takes you to get to your car, get in the car, get out of the car, that's enough time to get your exercise in for the day at the very beginning. And you just take that away from somebody because they have to come into an office. So I know there's a lot of discrepancy between what executives are saying and what employees want. I see a lot of people like really appreciating the hybrid model because you do get, that second or third place at work. So there is that social interaction aspect of it, which really is the only thing that I've seen to be a positive aspect that people try to argue. But like you said, the studies have shown that people are more productive, and I am assuming that we're going to start seeing some that say the other thing, that they're not anymore, just because this is such a hotly contested topic. But yeah, that's just my thoughts on it.
Yeah, the lack of relatedness, again, is a big issue if you're working from home and trying to find ways to meet that need intentionally, right? I think the overarching theme here is just being a little bit more intentional about meeting your psychological needs and ways that the job is designed or your life is designed. Maybe you were able to not be intentional and still had your needs met. But I think these days, like, we just don't have that luxury anymore and have to be a lot more intentional about it, and recognizing that what serves some people in the workplace might not serve others, right? So one of the big criticisms of return to the office initiatives is that the people who benefit the most from everyone working from home are people who are already marginalized. So like if you have rich minorities or working parents, particularly working mothers, they benefited the most from everyone working from home. But when we have return to office, we see that it's largely a much more negative experience for racial minorities who are now exposed to things like microaggressions again, and then working parents, particularly again working mothers, who the burden of childcare is falling on. There's a lot less flexibility when you're in the office, and so everyone working remotely in an office place or some sort of hybrid model, as you mentioned, puts everyone on sort of the same playing field. And so whatever policy an organization does have, it should be enforced. So if it's come in 3 days a week, it should be come in 3 days a week, no more, no less. Because we see that there's an in-group that can form of people who always come in, and it tends to be the people who have the luxury, the privilege of always coming in, and that tends to be people who already have power societally as well as in the organization.
Yeah, actually, referencing who comes into work and who doesn't, and I had a past sales position where there was one guy who you were only supposed to be there 5 days a week, but he would come in 6 because we were open 6. And over time, he just built up, such a larger customer base than everybody else that there was a huge discrepancy in how people felt about him being there, to the point where they had to kind of reverse course on that.
Wow.
What about authenticity at work? Is that what employers actually want? I see a lot of jokes going around saying, "Oh, be your true self, be authentic," and then it's like, "Here's your letter of termination," like a week later. So, what are your thoughts on that?
I think it really depends on the type of authenticity we're talking about. There's some cool research on authenticity as far as like hidden identities. So if you're someone with a non-visible disability or someone who is like a sexual minority, being authentic at work largely leads to better outcomes as long as it's safe, right? There's some research that says like if you are in an organization where you will be harmed for being out at work, or you're in a broader culture or society where you'll be harmed, then it's not actually beneficial. But generally, for people who are in a safe enough space, being authentic and out at work about whatever hidden identity does result in better outcome. And again, it kind of goes back to that cognitive resources, always having to be on your toes, hiding, your sexual orientation or hiding your hidden disability, right? Not being out about like having dyslexia or ADHD takes resources and energy and mental effort. And so that leaves fewer resources for you to focus on your work, to focus on emotion regulation. And so it might make you less pleasant to be around, or certainly it's going to harm your affective experience. It's going to harm your emotions, and it might make you less productive at your job. So in that respect, authenticity beneficial. I think where it comes into sort of that negative perspective is where authenticity bleeds into, well, I'm no longer surface acting. I'm no longer displaying emotions that are expected of me. I'm displaying my true emotional experience. And that largely, from a workplace perspective, organizations still want you to provide service with a smile. Organizations still want you to be friendly to others. And so they don't want authenticity in the respect of like, please be rude to your coworkers and to clients and to customers. We do know that like hiding those emotions is taxing, is emotionally draining, does harm performance in other domains as well as like your life domain outside of work. But if you can, find a way to authentically engage in those emotions. And so rather than, for example, if you have like really terrible table as a server, instead of just like, okay, thank you, and on the inside you're dying, but you're still providing service with a smile, I think like the true authentic people would say like, be rude back to them. That's not going to work for you in the long run or for the organization. But if you can find some way to genuinely feel happy in that moment, whether you're thinking about like, oh, these are just people going through a hard day, or like we have working class solidarity, or like I am going to go on vacation in 3 days, or you're thinking back to a different, better table, something that can help you genuinely experience that positive emotion that you're being asked to display, so you can authentically display that emotion rather than the one you're initially feeling. That does take a little bit more effort in the short run, but in the long run, results in better outcomes, leaves more resources for you to emotionally regulate in other times and perform better in your workplace. And so, I hope that answers your question. It's complicated. Authenticity looks a lot different in different ways.
I'll authentically suppress my negative emotions. No,
Yeah,
don't worry.
yeah.
What about sick days at work and people who attend work while sick? What is that looking like in the aftermath of COVID? I know I worked at a bar for a while right before COVID, and it was kind of, writing was on the wall that if you didn't show up to work, even if you were kind of sick, you would be in trouble.
Mhm.
And then overnight, it completely flipped. If you even had a slight cough, not coming to work. So,
Yeah.
so is that still persisting? And that's sort of, I guess, overreaction to COVID.
That's a great question. I think the tolerance for people missing work has returned back to pre-COVID times, where you are, I think, broadly, you are still sort of expected to come to work sick. What's really interesting is that missing work, or what like our field would call absenteeism, is considered a negative work behavior. We don't want you to miss work. Presenteeism, showing up to work sick, is also considered a negative behavior. We don't want you to engage in presenteeism. And so then the question is like, well, what do I do? And there was a really cool paper also recently published. It was about COVID during the COVID era, but I mean, I think broadly any sort of public health concern, right? You like from a public health perspective, you should stay home if you're sick, right? We don't want you spreading the flu. We don't want you spreading COVID or any sort of other illness from a public health perspective, recognizing that not everyone has this privilege, either as an organization, like the organization has to continue to run, but also individually, like if you are commission based or you don't have paid sick leave, things along those lines, you're in a much more precarious position. And so that's probably going to push you towards showing up to work even when you're really sick. And so I think that speaks to a more structural change that's needed, that we need to staff organizations with enough people where we can handle missing people for sick days without performance suffering. We need to make sure that people have access to paid sick leave to make sure that from a, again, public health perspective, they're not coming to work. There was part of that paper pointed towards workplace outbreaks as some of the largest super spreader events during the COVID initial wave of the COVID pandemic in 2020. And so again, like as going back to the lack of a third space, work is one of the main places you're exposed to illness. And so what can we do to reduce that from, again, a public health perspective? And the answer is not just unlimited PTO. We know that people who have unlimited PTO are actually less likely to use their paid time off than people who have a set number of days. And that goes both for like vacation as well as sick days.
Yeah, I think a hybrid model would do very well under this sort of thing, because you could choose to still work but be at home and kind of meet both ends of that. Whereas if you're required to be in work every day of the week, there's going to be that conflicting issue there with presenteeism.
Yeah,
So that would
absolutely.
be how I would solve it. I would say, well, you can, 2 days out of the week you can come in, and then the rest you choose.
Mhm.
Um, how should someone approach politics at work, especially if they're in the minority?
Yeah, there's been a few papers, unsurprisingly, recently published about politics at work, because I think we've been having a lot of those discussions. And I think that, this intertwines with that authenticity perspective, because in one perspective, everything is political. Work itself is a political experience. The relationship between employer and employee is a political relationship. And so I think it is not appropriate to say don't discuss politics at work, because everything is politics. I think the research suggests that if you're in the minority, for example, in a workplace, it can be really alienating. So if you're the lone leftist in a conservative organization, or you're a lone conservative in like a really progressive organization, that can be really isolating and result in some negative psychological outcomes, negative work outcomes. And so I think largely we just want to value inclusion here in the workplace and recognize that everyone's there to get a job done, and make sure that to the degree that we can, that the workplace is not hostile towards anyone. Otherwise it's going to detract from performance. And again, I think there are limits to that, because the work is a political space and a political activity. And for some people, it's explicitly political, right? If you are in sort of the legal profession or things along those lines, or like teaching, a formerly sort of apolitical profession is now highly politicized. And so a lot of people don't have the luxury of not discussing politics at work. And so I think just approaching this the way that you approach everything else, or that we've talked about approaching everything else, with intentionality, and inclusivity and valuing both your own personal boundaries as well as the boundaries of other people should facilitate a better working experience for everyone. More research is coming, I'm sure. There's only a handful of papers that I'm aware of that have touched on this topic. And so I'm really interested to see where this goes.
Yeah, I only see it getting more relevant as time goes on, unfortunately.
Yeah, absolutely.
Well, this has been great. Lots of insights there. Really appreciate everything you were able to bring to the table.
Thanks so much. This was a blast.
Yeah, where could people go if they'd like to hear more from you?
Yeah, feel free to follow our podcast, Healthy Work. You can find it on any podcatching software or healthywork.substack.com. I have my lab website at Colorado State University, so you can just Google my name and Colorado State. So feel free to email me if you have questions or want to talk. I'm always happy.
Awesome. Well, thank you very much, Keaton.